Folklore and fairy tales. Happily ever after? Absolutely. In an academic backpedaling, burning witches at the stake kind of way. So in Ronald Hutton's Triumph of the Moon, Chapter 7, Finding a Folklore, he focuses on some themes that are actually pretty interesting and pertinent to current academia. But before we get into all of that, let's set the time frame of where we are in time and history in Hutton's book. So in the 1870s, evolution had sort of taken hold of the social zeitgeist, and everyone was kind of accepting that, humanity had developed from apes or frogs or monkeys or whatever you want to say. And since evolution was taking hold, it was actually kind of normal for other academic studies to use the Darwinian model as a template for their progression of studies. In between anthropology and geology, which both mirrored those ideas of evolution, we have the rise of folklore. Folklore didn't actually kind of make it as an official academic study. I mean, you can actually take a folklore class in college now today, but now typically we refer to that as, religious or anthropological studies. But what is important to note is that within folklore and anthropology, both adopted the Darwinian model as a system of progression from humanity in its earliest genesis to the contemporary state it is in now. From this we get the idea of the noble savage. Enter Sir James Frazer, who wrote The Golden Bough. The Golden Bough deals with a couple of different topics, but focuses mainly upon the aspect of a dying and returning god. He lays out the foundation of the evolution of society as you start out as the noble savage, a tribal people, you believe in magic, shamans, you progress away from that to a monotheism, Christianity, and then from that you progress into scientific or secular thought. Like I said earlier, he dealt with the dying god, but also with an earth goddess. This was a text that was actually meant to discredit religion and insist that society needed to progress towards science to become more evolved. But what's really interesting and ironic is that it actually kind of bolstered the idea of a religious mysticism. What's actually kind of funny is that the general public seized the Golden Bough and used it as a celebration for ancient societies and tribal cultures and modes of worship. Scholars were a little bit less friendly towards Frazer. Responding to Frazer's work, one academic, Wittgenstein, you've heard of him, right, said Frazer is much more savage than these savages. Burn. But enough about Frazer. In 1880 to 1930, there was a shift in thinking that idealized the countryside. In 1810, 80% of the people in England lived in the countryside. By 1910, that had reversed and 80% lived in the cities. So think about it, you've got a bunch of people living in the city, and there's smog, there's dirt, there's grime, they're working factory jobs, it really sucks. You're developing emphysema from all of the coal mining and shit like that. And then you think back to when you were a kid on Gran's farm, when you were healthy and happy and didn't have to work in the factory. It's really not that far of a jump to see how the countryside was idealized with the development of urban areas. What is kind of interesting to think about, though, is that urbanism, once used to be understood as the mecca of intellectualism and liberalism, had suddenly become a representation of just this awful, caustic zeitgeist that nobody could spiritually or morally develop. That means that the countryside became that place where you could escape and grow as a person and reconnect with nature. Folklorists of this time, with the resurgence of the popularity for the countryside, started looking for the quintessential Englishness. Nationalism was actually kind of going around all over the globe. The Germans were looking for what was German. The French were looking for what was French. Folklorists thought that they could find that Englishness within the countryside and the folk traditions of their recent past. Recent, not so recent, or made-up past. There we go. These folklorists, however, were not looking for a paganism of Olympia, of pillared temples, of Homer. They were looking for that really dirty, tribal, mud paint, sarong, ponytail-wearing tribalism that is actually really popular today and super not English at all. Now, the chapter focuses mainly on specific folkloric events and studies that have happened in separate places in England, and I'm an American, and I cannot tell you a city in England outside of London. So I'm actually going to gloss over all of those specific instances and talk about the undercurrent dialogue that's going on in the chapter. The trend of folklore scholars was basically this: a yearning for English paganism, observing folk traditions, taking that observation and turning it into the definitive past, making implications in their favor, and burying their head in the sand if anybody says anything contrary. This happens in academia today! One notable example of this refurbishing of folklore is the rise of the Green Man. Lady Raglan in 1939 declared that all of the foliate heads on the churches and cathedrals in England were actually representations of the Green Man. And maybe they are, but which came first? The folklorist who popularized the idea, or the image which resembled what the folklorist wanted to see? To explain this, maybe we could make up a future equivalent. So let's say 500 years from now, we've got these folklorists who are studying contemporary society of right now, of the present. And they've got crosses everywhere in their studies. They see the Christian cross and they're like, what does this symbol mean? Well, in the future, in these future anthropologists and folklorists' times, the cross actually symbolizes something completely different, like Gouda cheese. So, the folklorists of the future, wanting to prove that this symbol over here in the past means something, they're like, oh gee, what does it mean over here in the present? It means Gouda cheese. Oh my god, everybody in the past was all about Gouda cheese. Because that symbol for Gouda cheese that we have now, it's fucking everywhere. And thus we have the age-old practice of academics projecting onto the past what they want to see. And that's basically it for the folklore chapter. But I promised you burning people at the stake. Let's talk about finding witchcraft. Okay, so we've got the Enlightenment, and they're like, okay, witchcraft doesn't actually exist. People can't harm anybody with magic. People can't curse anybody. And oh shit, what do we do about the 50,000 people we... To academically backpedal and explain all of this away, we can see the emergence of two camps of thought, clerics and liberals. Look at my notes. So in 1828, we've got this German cleric, Karl Ernst Yarka, and he decides that the witches that we had burned and put to the stake or hung or whatever that the Germans did to them, they were actually an ancient pagan religion, and with the rise of Christianity, these German Christian peasants didn't like these antisocial pagans, and they were like, get the fuck out of our village. And so these ancient pagans are like, fuck you. And then these German peasants are like, oh my god, you're Satanist because you're not Christian. And so the pagans are like, yeah, because that scares you. And thus the Christian faith stamped them out because they decided to call themselves Satanist. This was great, except Germany was trying to establish this quintessential Germanness, you know, what it is to be German, and to establish that national identity. So, Franz Josef Mona decided to take up Yarka's idea and say that, well, they were ancient pagan religions, but they weren't German ancient pagan religions. They were actually like this bastardized cult from Greece. This brilliantly supports three ideas. They were in fact pagan, but they weren't German pagans, and so the German church could actually stamp them out and dismiss it altogether. By 1844, Jacob Grimm, a German folklorist, decides to combine both of these theories, but in light of the Enlightenment, stresses the fact that even though they were pagan or presumed Satanists of their own self-identification, they could not actually do any harm to anybody. This was all a social argument for the church. The church was safeguarding German culture because antisocial, satanic peasants were seen as forces of revolution that would threaten the stability of the German society. So that's the clerical argument. But we also have the liberal argument against the church. Enter Jules Michelet. So in 1862, we've got this writer, Michelet. He's a historian, and he absolutely hates the monarchy, and he absolutely hates the church. He was busy writing this huge tome about the French Revolution, but to support himself through that, he would write potboilers. One of these potboilers, to bring in some extra cash while he was working on his larger project of the history of France, was La Sorcière. Alongside La Sorcière, he also has La Femme. These two books are really interesting commentaries on gender. He thought that women would usher in a new golden era of society. He actually said that women were the higher sex, that man is not equal to woman. This sounds like feminism, but it's not. Because Michelet's idealized vision of woman was the angel in the house. She was unfit for work because of her menstrual cycle, and as far as being connected to nature, she needed to stay in the house. This doesn't make a lot of sense. He actually thought, though, that woman would usher in this new era of social and cultural enlightenment because she would be a good housewife. And if any of you can tell me how that actually works, please comment below. But back to La Sorcière. This potboiler that Michelet wrote was, bad. The research that he did for La Sorcière was sparse, drawing from a few texts of medieval antiquity, like Malleus Maleficarum. Close enough. This text is kind of outrageous because it's all of the stereotypical ideas of a fairy tale witch. Dancing in the woods at midnight, having sex with Satan, sacrificing babies, having a job. French academics knew that all of this was bullshit. But like The Golden Bough, it was taken up by the general public as something that was kind of fantastic and a good read. His work actually influenced two significant Americans. Hey, an American in pagan history, look at that. In 1893, Matilda Jocelyn Gage wrote this feminist text to, for the rights of women, to move up, to move out of the kitchen, to vote. She used La Sorcière as a source book, saying that women used to be empowered, that they used to work with the peasants, that they used to work with the disenfranchised, that they were liberated free spirits, and that patriarchy and the system of the church had actually broken down women in the witch hunts. A more significant influence of Michelet's work, though, is on Charles Godfrey Leland, who in 1898 wrote Aradia. Leland traveled the world and settled in Florence, focusing upon the subject of stragia, or Italian witchcraft. Working with a gypsy assistant named Maddalena, he compiles folklores, stories, traditions of all of the ancient, or not so ancient, witch tales of the Italian variety. Melodia tells him of a Vangel, a holy book for the witches of Italy. As a side note, nobody else has ever heard or seen or found a Vangel. Melodia finally turns up a copy of this in her own handwriting, and then promptly vanishes and never sees Leland again. Leland takes this Vangel and writes Aradia. This is the holy book of contemporary witchcraft. Everybody thinks this is like the definitive history of, look, this is the Gospel of the Witches. Also its subtitle. Aradia focuses upon an interesting cosmology. We've got Diana as the creatrix of the universe, Lucifer, her son, god, brother, consort, thing, and their daughter Aradia. Aradia was sent to Earth to teach the plebeian peasants and thugs and thieves witchcraft, to overthrow their oppressors and bring unity and equality to all. As mentioned before, though, we kind of have to take this on our own personal faith with a grain of salt. It's up to you to believe whether you think Aradia is an authentic text or not. It is significant, however, to note that Leland's notion of witchcraft was not satanic. He differentiated himself from Michelet in saying that the god of the witches was not the devil or Lucifer, but in fact they had the goddess Diana. By the 1890s, it had become an integral text on the definition of what it meant to be a witch, at least in history. This notion was taken up by the Romantics. Remember that video? With the rise of Pan as a popular figure, as the green Jesus, as the god of the witches, Aradia becomes popular since Lucifer is used as a figure of a masculine deity, the language of the Romantics incorporating a horned god with their romance of nature, and the Christian blending of the two. A horned god can't be anybody but Lucifer. And so, by the opening of the 20th century, we have the notion that the persecuted witches of Christian Europe had actually represented a separate religion and ideology altogether. This notion was taken up and popularized by writers, but also by academics alike. It seems at last we have found a witchcraft from which contemporary paganism and Wicca can spring. And that, everyone, is chapters 7 and 8 of Ronald Hutton's Triumph of the Moon. What's to come next? Well, we have one more video in this installment, Matrix, and finding a god and goddess parents. After that, I really want to know what you think we should make videos of. But we have a few ideas. As much as I would like to be an ivory tower scholar, and I really want to be an ivory tower scholar, I'm not. I really want to draw inferences and connections between contemporary paganism and philosophical intellectual thought. Not saying that contemporary paganism isn't thoughtful. I just think it would be really relevant to have articulate and academically sanctioned discussions on contemporary paganism so we can really bring our religion to the forefront, so we can be on that panel of world religions. Right now we're toying with the ideas of focusing on very specific concrete practices of paganism or popular customs and beliefs like, you know, zodiac or specifically Wiccan spell work, correspondences, things like that, and linking them to philosophical theories, strains of thought, philosophers. Or we could go broader and ask questions like, is paganism a religion or is it a philosophy? Is it a way of life? Honestly, guys, the door is wide open. We can talk about whatever you want to talk about within reason. So guys, I've got plenty of books on my bookshelf and I've got some practical experience, so let me know what you want to see. Also, we are about to be going on a pagan festival and we're going to be bringing you along. I think that would be kind of fun, on the road with a pagan scholar. So that's one future video. But apart from that, I'm desperate for some ideas because this is slow going, this book. It's wonderful, it's fantastic, it's amazing, but book reviews are really difficult to do on video. I'm used to writing everything down as a philosophy student, so again, just give me your ideas, guys. As always, merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again.